as far as best practice for writing, I guess if we're talking about specifically API documentation, there definitely is, like a template to use, but there's a thing called developer experience, which is almost like user experience UX, but it's sort of more in the API kind of focus. And, it involves basically all the different things that you normally would do with user research, such as interviews and sort of remote usability tests, which are kind of interesting. You actually watch the developer, kind of going back to what I talked about before with onboarding, where you watch them try to use the quick start, for example, to make their first API call. Are they able to do that? How easy is that? There's other tools like crowdsourcing surveys, questionnaires, reviews. So these are all things that are good to happen like throughout the whole process. So normally, you have like normal phases of documentation where you have like requirements gathering, and then you have user research, drafting, reviews, and publication. So those are sort of like the high level, but then you can be doing, all these different techniques, basically.
Welcome to the Knowledgebase Ninjas podcast, where 𝐊𝐞𝐲 of Document 360 finds the best SaaS self-service knowledge bases in the world, and then interviews their creators. Let's get started with today's episode.
Good day, everyone. Welcome to Knowledgebase Ninjas podcast. Our guest today is Mark Wentowski, API documentation specialist at Techwritex. So welcome, Mark, to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Doing very well. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Great. So Mark, before we start with any further questions, I would like to understand a little bit more about yourself and how did you get into this professional journey, and who was your motivator to get into the space?
Yeah, sure. So I guess starting way back. So when I was sort of in my adolescence, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I was kind of good at writing, but I realized that the career opportunities were a little bit limited. That you could go into journalism or be an English professor or become a starving author or something. So when I was in college, I kind of felt the pressure building as I needed to sort of make a decision. And I knew I needed to find something that was had a practical business angle, but also allowed me to sort of express myself through writing. So how I discovered what a tech writer is one day I was just poring over, it seems like hundreds of job descriptions and job listings. And basically I stumbled upon this thing called a tech writer, and just something really clicked with it. I was like, wow, that's really interesting. I didn't know that someone would pay you to do something like that. It sounds really cool, as a job. So I read a bit further, and then I just really liked how it sort of merged the two worlds of writing and technology. And technology was something that I was had sort of like a growing interest in. And anyway, so I kind of went with that, and I eventually got my first job as a junior writer. But I guess backing up a little before that, I think I discovered Tom Johnson's blog. I'd Rather Be Writing. That was sort of one of my big inspirations, because I saw just the amount of content that he had on tech writing, as well as sort of personality wise. It just seemed like it was sort of like a good fit for it. And I knew at that stage I was a little bit inexperienced with like the technical aspects. So I taught myself programming, took a few online courses, and got involved with some open source projects, which is something I recommend to anyone who's just sort of starting out. And then later on, as things progressed, once again, kind of looking at Tom's stuff, he had like an API documentation course, and that's how I got into API documentation. And I eventually switched over to I only sort of did that sort of documentation instead of the user interface stuff. So that's sort of how I got into it, and what led to me being a tech writer.
Great to hear, Mark, and thank you for all the contributions you're making towards the community as well. And let's talk a little bit more about API documentation, because as you rightly said, that's your specialty, if we call it as. So is there any standard structure that technical writers should adhere when it comes to API documentation?
Well, there's a lot of aspects of API documentation. So the most familiar that you've probably seen are Swagger documentation, which is documentation that's automatically generated from what's called the Open API spec, which is basically the overall structure of the API, basically how the API is coded. And then it kind of you use Swagger basically spits out what the API is, all the different requests and all the different parameters you can use. And that's one part of the documentation that's very important. And tech writers get involved heavily with that, with writing descriptions for fields and parameters and resources and so forth. That's one aspect of it. And then the other very sort of writing intensive one is what's called sort of conceptual documentation, which is, think of more of that as user guides in a sense. As far as structure, there is kind of a basic structure. So usually it starts out as some sort of onboarding / get started, where the developer is taken through the quickest route possible to using the API. Usually there's some kind of quick start or some kind of command or tool that kind of gets them up to speed as soon as possible. That's the ideal. Sometimes if it's not an easy onboarding situation, it could be bad as far as them wanting to use the API. So it's a very important aspect. Then there's other ones such as key concepts. So this would be kind of broad, but just listing out the different concept ideas that are part of maybe they're industry topics, maybe they're domain topics, maybe there's just maybe it's a large platform and the user who's using the API needs to be familiar with the other aspects of the platform. So that's sort of an important part as well. Yeah, and then there's other things. There's step-by-step guides, coding tutorials where it actually shows you how to use the API to write an app. So basically write an app that incorporates the API's functionality into it. There's things like frequently asked questions, FAQs, definitely probably missing some in there, but I think you kind of get the idea. So it's basically everything that you would have in normal documentation for a product, for example, but it's going to be slightly more aimed at more of like a technical audience rather than user interface. So maybe a short and it's obviously a huge topic, so I don't want to go too off the deep end with it.
I understand. And can you name some of the components of API documentation, if that will help the audience?
Yeah, sure. So basically, that's sort of what I mentioned was the sections like the get started, key concepts. Then you want to mention the API architecture as well. You want to have the coding tutorials, code samples for coding tutorials and code samples a little bit different. Coding tutorials are, the coding tutorial is actually how to write an app to use certain features. And then I would distinguish that from use cases. Use cases are another important one where it's almost like a full workflow of it's not just including a functionality, it's basically a certain situation in the real world that they would actually use the API. So it's a full description that it includes architecture, it includes it's almost like its own little guide for the particular use case, and there's usually dozens of use cases for the APIs that are well documented, for example. And then you have that's conceptual documentation. Then you have the reference documentation, which basically just outlines the different endpoints. It outlines the parameters that can be used per endpoint. Shows the schemas. So there's a lot of different components to the reference documentation as well. So those are kind of the main ones.
Great. And whenever we talk about such big topic or huge topic, one thing I would like to ask is on the best practices, because it's so easy to get diverted and diversified. So any best practices you can suggest to our audiences today, please?
Yeah, sure. So as far as best practice for writing, I guess if we're talking about specifically API documentation, there definitely is, like a template to use, but there's a thing called developer experience, which is almost like user experience UX, but it's sort of more in the API kind of focus. And, it involves basically all the different things that you normally would do with user research, such as interviews and sort of remote usability tests, which are kind of interesting. You actually watch the developer, kind of going back to what I talked about before with onboarding, where you watch them try to use the quick start, for example, to make their first API call. Are they able to do that? How easy is that? There's other tools like crowdsourcing surveys, questionnaires, reviews. So these are all things that are good to happen throughout the whole process. So normally, you have like normal phases of documentation where you have like requirements gathering, and then you have, user research, drafting, reviews and publication. So those are sort of like the high level, but then you can be doing, all these different techniques basically for developer experience. And for me personally, like I find the most beneficial is to have like contact with the developer as they're using the product. So on a call, for example, so like a live interview of working with the developer and basically hearing, seeing where they're tripping up, or hearing their opinion directly, rather than sort of through support structures and stuff. And that's sort of that's something else that I find very challenging. If you're in a large organization, for example, then typically like the tech writers are separated from the support staff or other people that are sort of interacting with the customer. So you sort of get it as a tech writer, you get secondhand information because they're sort of giving you information from their perspective. They aren't really taking it from, as a tech writer, from your perspective. So that can be quite challenging. And recently I work with more like smaller companies now, which are really good because usually smaller companies, that are just starting out, like delivering APIs, they usually have some sort of partnership, and there's like a weekly call with developers, and it's really good to really easy to kind of jump on a call basically. So my opinion is I think tech writers should be interacting with customers basically. I feel like they shouldn't be left out of that. I think that's a key piece, because the other elements I mentioned are good, like surveys, questionnaires, it's all good, but you really need to be interacting with the person using a product. That's my belief. So.
Right. Very well said, Mark. So it's when you want to produce a good quality documentation, your interaction with various teams at an early stages are very vital for your output. So I would definitely echo your words in that. And so we spoke about the best practices, some of the components of API documentation. So the other important topic is on the challenges faced by technical writers when it comes to API documentation. So have you come across any in your initial days that you can share with us?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges is that with this sort of job description, you are a lot of tech writers, they start out doing user interface documentation. That's definitely my experience, and then they sort of move into APIs, and then when you get into API documentation, you're interacting a lot with developers. So developers are a lot different from people you normally interact with say people that are involved with developing software products with user interface and so forth. It kind of gets into more the sort of back end sort of aspect of things with app development, and there's a whole sort of like ecosystem of things you need to be familiar with. You need to be familiar with like with Git and using writing in Markdown and using static site generators instead of using certain other tools. So you're basically trying to get as close to developers as possible, working with them using the tools and processes that they use. So that can be quite challenging. That's definitely like the one of the biggest learning curves, and then also learning APIs. You obviously take an API documentation course, but the APIs in themselves are like this huge topic. Because there's many different types of APIs, and the ones you're working on are different. There's APIs for IoT, Internet of Things. There's very domain specific APIs. It could be, like payment providers, for example. So that's a whole domain of them. So the biggest challenge really is that you might know, how, the components of API documentation, but there's so much domain specific things that are from API to API that need to be learned to fully understand the use cases, for example, for APIs and why they're used. So that's kind of a challenge, but it's also the most rewarding thing because you're learning a lot, the technical aspects, but then you're also learning more of industries and domain topics and so forth. So that's all good. And you can kind of pick a niche as well. So like recently I sort of kind of learned a lot about fintech, which is one of the biggest types of APIs now, with things like payment providers like Stripe and ADN. And so forth. So yeah, it's cool. You can kind of pick the area that you kind of want to go into. I think that pretty much answers your question. That's what I find the most challenging, is sort of always staying up to date, and that you have a familiarity with concepts that are being discussed in the documentation. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you recommend, or do you think a knowledge-based solution can solve at least some of these challenges that you cited previously?
Yeah, it's the thing with this is sort of a part of a broader topic on tooling, which is something that I deal with a lot. So I try to either a company has invested in a tool, and then they need help actually migrating it or using the tool or doing it. So my approach is very tools agnostic. So I'm not attached to any one tool. It could be the customer might have built their own tool. It could be this huge open source thing, or they could be using something like MacFlip or something like that. So basically, my approach is understanding the tools, seeing the advantages and disadvantages. There's no perfect tool. Seeing the advantages and disadvantages. If someone needs help, choosing a tool, then what tool best fits their situation. And if it's something that they've already chosen and invested in, then that's sort of that's obviously the approach that would be taken. So I think I guess what I'm saying is I think tools are important. I think that tools can have features that definitely can help. Like, for example, if a tool has really good analytics or something like that, that's definitely a huge plus. You obviously have to know what to do with the analytics, and you have to know how to use the tool in the right way. But I recommend taking a holistic approach to tools. But to answer your question, yes, I feel tools can solve problems, basically, is what my end sort of thing is. And to sort of pick tools that solve your problems. I guess that's my message.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
So
yeah.
that's great to hear, Mark. Let's move on to the rapid fire round questions. So
Okay.
can you share a documentation related resource you have consumed recently?
Yeah, it's kind of nerdy. It's I've been reading a lot of docs for static site generators. So those are basically they're basically websites that are you can run a command and it takes a bunch of files and then spits it out. It's kind of a whole thing, but they're basically tools you can use for documentation. And I've been using the Astro framework, which is a static site generator that's I like a lot so far. It's very documentation focused. And the other one's Next.js, which is more of a framework for creating apps and so forth. So those are the two that I've been looking into. Yeah.
Thank you. And what's that one word that comes to your mind when someone says documentation?
When someone says documentation, I guess what I think is it's how do I say this? It's like there's a whole world there of documentation. So usually they're just when they say documentation, they're only referring to one aspect, which is the writing of the document. But then I feel like there's like a whole world around it as far as understanding the user, and then doing doing the requirements gathering and the research and all that aspect of it. So it's not just the writing, and then improving your documentation portal and all this other stuff. So basically, I think it sounds narrow when someone uses it, when it's actually like this, a lot more to it, and depends if they have time to hear about it. Yeah.
Okay. And my last question is, what is that one piece of documentation related advice you would give to your 20-year-old self?
Okay, that's a good one. Let's see. I think probably just like stay curious, and one of the most important things for me is like asking questions. You have to establish those relationships with people. It could be that it's someone who has a particular bit of knowledge that you need to do a certain aspect of your job, or it's a topic that that you're interested in and want to pursue further. Just try to locate those people that that have patience, basically, and are willing to sort of ask your questions, and don't be afraid to go down rabbit holes exploring, even if you don't know why you're doing it at the moment or what the outcome is. So just stay curious. And that's what I recommend. Because I feel like when I was my younger self might have been more like, oh, I feel like I'm annoying this person, or I'm asking too many questions. So as someone like in my position now, I really love it when someone asks me questions and wants to learn more. So that's something I would put out there. So
Great, Mark. So I think we are almost to the end of the podcast. Anything else I missed to ask you, or is there anything you would like to convey to our audiences today?
I don't think so. I think you had one good question in there. I don't. You kind of mentioned that you might bring it up as far as if you have good quality documentation. Do you think that does that reduce your workload? That was like one of the things I thought was really interesting. That it doesn't really reduce your workload, but it's kind of like in a good way. It just means as a tech writer, you can focus on other things besides the writing. So like adding features to your website, or researching technologies, or spending more time on strategy. So you might outsource your writing to other stakeholders, but you switch roles and become the reviewer in that instance. So having good quality documentation is a really good thing, because it allows you to sort of put on different hats and sort of switch roles. So yeah.
Absolutely. Well, once again, thank you for your time, Mark, with us today. And it was an absolute pleasure to share some of your experiences with us and the audience. I wish you all the very best for your future projects, and we'll keep in touch.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care, Mark.
Yes. Okay. Take care. Bye.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Knowledgebase Ninjas podcast. Please head to iTunes, rate, and provide honest feedback on the podcast. See you next week.